Hello, welcome to Regime Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 66 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about the SQL Server session state mode. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch part 63, 64, and 65 of this video series. Now, ASP.NET session state mode can be anything that you can see on the screen from 1 to 5. It can be off, in which case it's going to disable the session state for the entire application. If an ASP.NET web application is not using session state, then it makes sense to disable session state to improve the performance of the application. Now we discussed about inproc in part 64. When we set the session state mode to inproc, then the session state variables are stored inside the ASP.NET worker process. Whereas when we set the session state mode to state server, the session state variables are stored inside an ASP.NET state service. When we set the session state mode to SQL Server, the session state variables are stored in a SQL Server database. On the other hand, when we set the session state mode to custom, that enables us to build our own session state provider. For example, if I want to store my session state variables in an Oracle database, then I can use a custom session state mode. Now, when we set the session state mode to SQL Server, the session state variables are stored in a SQL Server database. So obviously we need a SQL Server database which is going to store these session state variables. So do I have to create the database and the tables manually? No, we don't have to. Microsoft has actually provided us with a tool called ASP.NET_register SQL.exe, which we can use. Now, the version of the tool that you use depends on the type of the operating system that you have, whether it's 32-bit or 64-bit. And the version of .NET framework that you have, whether it's 2.0, 3.0, or 4.0. Okay, on my machine I have Windows operating system, 64-bit Windows operating system, and .NET version 4.0. So I'm going to use the tool that is present in C:\\. Windows is the directory of the operating system, and within Windows, Microsoft.NET, and within Microsoft.NET directory, I have 64-bit operating system, so I'm going to select framework 64, and I have .NET 4.0, so I'm going to select version 4.0. If I have 2.0, for example, I select 2.0, and then I use ASP.NET_register SQL from that folder. But I have 4.0, so I'm going to use version 4.0 ASP.NET_register SQL.exe. Okay, so the tool is present in this path, so I cannot run the tool from here directly. I need to run this from the command prompt. Okay, so click on start, type run, press enter, type cmd in the run window and hit enter. So that should open up the command window. So in the command window we need to navigate to this path. So let me change the directory. So cd, change directory, copy the path and paste that within the command prompt and press enter. That should change to that directory. Let me type in CLS to clear the screen. And now here we need to type in a command to run the tool. And the command to run that tool, I have typed this just to save some time. Let me explain the options that we have here. So let me paste that. So the tool itself is ASP.NET_register SQL.exe, which is present at that path. Okay, and -s. So this switch, -s is a switch. So -s specifies the SQL Server name. Okay, so on the network, what's the name of the SQL Server? Now to find out that, within SQL Server Management Studio, you can right click on the server, on the node, and then go to the properties, and the properties window will show the name of the SQL Server. In my case, on my machine, it's called Prasad-PC. So that's the name of the SQL Server. So let me replace SQL Server name with the name of SQL Server on my machine. So let me delete that and then paste the name Prasad-PC. That's my SQL Server name. Okay, and the next switch that I have is -e. Now I'm saying, okay, I want to use this SQL Server. Okay, this is the SQL Server, Prasad-PC. On this SQL Server, how do you want to connect? Okay, -e specifies that I want to use Windows authentication or Windows credentials to connect to this SQL Server. Now, if you don't have Windows credentials, if you want to use SQL Server authentication, then you can specify your username and password that you use to connect to SQL Server. But then to use username and password, you have to use a different switch. For example, for username, -u, and for password, -p. Now, do we have to remember all these switches? No, you don't really have to, because there's an excellent article on MSDN at this URL, I will have this URL present on my blog, so you can copy it from there. So at this URL, it will tell us what are these switches. Now look at that. -s specifies the name of the server where we want to create that database. Okay, and -e specifies that I want to authenticate using Windows credentials. If I want to use a SQL Server username password, I can use -u and -p. Okay, all right. So I'm using Windows authentication, and then there is another switch, -ssad. What does that mean? SS stands for session state add. So I want to add the session state database to this SQL Server. Okay, so that's what that switch means. Again, the explanation for that switch is there in this article. So -ssadd adds support for the SQL Server mode session state. -ssremove will remove the state database. Okay, and the last one is -ss type p. Now look at this. When we add the session state database, I mean the tables and stored procedures, do we want to write them to a temporary database, or do we want to create them in the ASP state database? Now in most cases we want to create them in ASP state database, so I'm going to use -ss type as p. So that's the switch. Okay, so we are done. Now if you look at the SQL Server Management Studio, I don't have the ASP state database now at the moment. Okay, but then once we create that, now let me press enter with those changes there. So it's adding session state. After it is finished, when I refresh this node here, you should see a new database there, ASP state. And if you expand that and look at the tables, these are the tables that our ASP.NET application is going to use to read and write session state variables. Okay, now when we go back to the application, it's the same application that we have been using in the previous sessions. I have two web forms, web form 1, web form 2. On web form 1, I enter name and email address. When I click on go to web form 2, we go to web form 2. There we have two label controls where we'll display that name and email, and we are using session variables for that. Okay, now if we used nproc, these session variables will be stored inside the worker process. If we used state server, then they will be stored in an ASP.NET state service. But now we are going to use SQL Server, that is this database, ASP state database. So the first step is to actually create the database itself, and we did that using the registers SQL tool, ASP.NET_registers SQL tool. Okay, so the next step is to actually set the session state mode to SQL Server and specify the SQL connection string. Okay, so let's go to Visual Studio. In web.config file, we set the session state mode to SQL Server. Okay, so you're telling the session state mode is SQL Server. So obviously you'll also have to tell where is that SQL Server present. Is it present on the same machine, or is it present on a different machine? If it's present on a different machine, tell me the name or the IP address of the machine and the credentials that I have to use to connect to that SQL Server. So how do I specify that? I specify that using SQL connection attribute. So SQL connection string attribute, and then I have to specify the data source. In my case, it's going to be dot, because that's the SQL Server installation is also present on my machine. And then I also need to specify user ID and password, but I'm going to use Windows authentication, so I'm going to say integrated security is equal to SSPI, but you can also use user ID and password. Now when I use integrated security, so now we are all done. We have created the database. So we have created this ASP state database. We have configured the session state mode to SQL Server. We specified the connection string. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run this as it stands. Now I'm going to get an error, but we'll fix that in just a bit. Okay, look at that. Failed to log in to session state SQL Server for user IIS Apple ASP.NET version 4.0. Now the error message actually makes sense. Now it's trying to access that ASP state database, this database, and the .NET runtime is using IIS Apple this login to log into that database. Now I don't have that login configured in my machine. That's why it's saying failed to log in. And there are several ways to correct this error. And the easiest way to do that is to open the IIS. Okay, and to open IIS, you can click on Start, type Run, hit Enter. In the Run window, type inet manager and hit Enter. So once you hit Enter, it's going to open IIS. So within IIS, by the way, I have IIS 7.0 on my machine. So within IIS, expand the IIS node and application pool. Select that, and I have .NET version 4.0, so ASP.NET version 4.0. Right click on that and select advanced settings. So now if you look at this identity, it's using the application pool identity. That's why it's actually using that worker process. I mean that login. Now I don't want to use that login. Instead, I want to use local system login. Okay, so when I select local system account, it's going to use the account that I already have on the SQL Server to connect to that ASP state database. So now if I refresh this, it's going to work. Okay, so now I type in, let's say, the username as Prajim, the email as prajimtech.com. I hit enter. Go to web form 2. Look at that. Now these session state variables are actually stored in a SQL Server database. Now if I go to the task manager, show all processes from all users, and then I select w3 wp.exe, I end the process, and then look at that. I refresh this. I still have my variables there, my session state variables. Similarly, even if I stop the ASP.NET State service, it's not going to affect me. Why? Because these session variables are actually now stored in this ASP state database tables. Okay, so even I restart my web server, restart my SQL server, my state variables will not be lost unless they are timed out. Okay, that's why SQL Server is the most reliable option. Okay, so now let's look at the advantages of using SQL Server session state mode. SQL Server is the most reliable option, survives worker process recycling and SQL Server restarts. Can be used with web forms and web gardens. It's the same as state server. When a client requests a web form, and if that web form is using session state variables, those session state variables are not stored on the web servers. Instead, they are stored on the SQL Server database. Okay, now depending on irrespective of whether the request goes to web server 1, web server 2, or web server 3, all of them are going to contact the same SQL server for session state variables. Okay, so in a web farm or a web garden, we will not have any issues with sessions. So it's ideal for web farms and web gardens. We can use any of the out of process session state mode. We can also use state server for web farms and web gardens. And it's more scalable than state server and nproc session state modes. Obviously, we are using SQL Server, so no matter how many users you have, the web server memory is not going to be increased because they are going to be persisted into SQL Server database. More scalable than state server and nproc session state modes. Disadvantages of using state server session state mode: slower than state server and nproc session state modes. That's because with SQL Server, the data is now stored in the hard disk. Hard disk has moving parts, so obviously anytime you want to retrieve data from hard disk, it's much slower than retrieving data from the memory, from RAM. Okay, so that's why it's definitely slower than nproc and session state modes. And complex objects, just like ASP.NET State Server, even for SQL Server, the complex objects needs to be serialized and deserialized. Okay, one common interview question that's asked as far as session state modes are concerned, what are the out of process session state modes, state server and SQL Server? And the in process is nproc session state mode. Okay, and obviously each session state mode has their own advantages and disadvantages, and there are a lot of interview questions on session state modes, so it will be very useful if you understand these concepts properly. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.